Right now, as I'm recording this in mid-2025, within months after Trump's second inauguration, Western allies scrambled to fill a $14 billion shortfall in Ukraine support as American aid dropped dramatically. European leaders are making moves that would have been unthinkable just 2 years ago. And the financial data from the first half of 2025 reveals just how rapidly everything is changing. Trump's return to office has triggered a cascade of policy shifts that most foreign policy experts never anticipated, forcing Europe to confront a fundamental question that has defined transatlantic relations for decades. Will Europe finally move to defend itself without the United States? The answer lies in the numbers that started it all. The numbers that changed everything. U.S. military aid to Ukraine paused in early 2025, leaving just $4 billion in the first quarter compared to $18 billion in the same period of 2024. The raw numbers reveal the scale of this shift. During the first quarter of 2024, the United States provided approximately $18.4 billion in military assistance to Ukraine. In the first quarter of 2025, that figure dropped to just $4.1 billion. This represents one of the largest single-quarter aid cuts in recent U.S. history. The financial gap this created was immediate and massive. Europe had provided approximately $10.4 billion in military aid between January and April 2025, but to maintain Ukraine's current military operations at 2024 levels, they would need to nearly double their recent $10 billion contribution per quarter to close the gap. For perspective, this amount exceeds the entire annual defense budget of countries like Belgium or Denmark. The European Union's total military aid to Ukraine in all of 2024 was $31.2 billion, meaning they would need to nearly double their annual contribution just to cover the American shortfall for 1 year. When news of these cuts reached Brussels in late February 2025, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called an emergency meeting within 48 hours. The initial reaction from European leaders reflected the gravity of the situation. French President Emmanuel Macron publicly stated that Europe faced a choice between strategic autonomy or strategic irrelevance. The meeting lasted 14 hours, with heated exchanges between Eastern European nations who demanded immediate action and Western European countries who questioned whether such massive expenditures were sustainable. The mathematics of the situation created an impossible equation for European treasuries. Germany's defense minister calculated that covering just their proportional share of the American aid reduction would require increasing their defense spending by an additional 0.4% of GDP. For France, the figure was 0.3%. Poland, already spending 3.9% of GDP on defense, would need to reach 4.7% to maintain current Ukrainian supply levels. These percentages translate to tens of billions of euros that European governments would need to find in their already stretched budgets. The military consequences appeared almost immediately on Ukrainian battlefields. By April 2025, Ukrainian forces reported a 43% reduction in artillery shell availability compared to the previous year. Advanced air defense systems that required American maintenance contracts began experiencing longer downtimes. The flow of precision-guided munitions, which had been crucial to Ukrainian defensive operations, slowed to levels not seen since early 2023. Ukrainian military commanders privately expressed concerns that without European intervention, they would be forced to adopt more defensive postures by summer. The crisis exposed deep divisions within European leadership that had been simmering for months. Poland and the Baltic states pushed for immediate, massive increases in military aid to Ukraine, arguing that Russian success would threaten their own security directly. Germany and France preferred a more measured approach, seeking to negotiate with both Washington and Moscow for a political solution. Italy and Spain questioned whether such enormous expenditures were justified when their own economies were struggling with inflation and unemployment. These disagreements created a 3-week period where European response remained fragmented and ineffective. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking in ways that European politicians had never experienced before. Unlike typical EU decision-making processes that could take months or years, The Ukrainian military situation demanded answers within weeks. Artillery stockpiles were depleting at rates that would become critical by June 2025. Training programs for Ukrainian personnel, previously funded by American contracts, faced cancellation by May. The usual European approach of lengthy consultation and consensus building simply couldn't match the urgency of the military timeline. The pressure created by this impossible timeline forced European leaders to consider options that would have been politically unthinkable just months earlier. Emergency sessions of national parliaments were called across Europe to authorize unprecedented defense expenditures. The German Bundestag held its first weekend emergency session in 15 years to approve additional military spending. The French National Assembly passed emergency legislation allowing the government to redirect funds from social programs to military aid without the usual legislative review process. European defense ministers began discussing something that had never existed before, a unified European military aid mechanism that could operate independently of both NATO and individual national decisions. The concept emerged from a simple recognition that Europe's current fragmented approach to military assistance was too slow and inefficient to respond to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. If America could cut aid by such dramatic amounts in 3 months, Europe needed systems that could scale up just as quickly. By late April 2025, the outlines of Europe's response began to emerge. The European Council authorized the creation of the European Defense Solidarity Fund, a financial mechanism specifically designed to provide rapid military assistance to European partners and allies. Unlike existing EU defense initiatives, this fund would operate with streamlined decision-making processes and pre-authorized spending limits that could be activated within days rather than months. The initial commitments to this fund shocked even the European officials who proposed it. France committed 47 billion euros over 4 years. Germany pledged 52 billion euros. Poland, despite its smaller economy, committed 23 billion euros, representing the largest military expenditure in Polish history. When all European contributions were tallied, the European Defense Solidarity Fund reached 247 billion euros, making it the largest pooled military fund in European history. This fund represented more than just money. It marked Europe's first concrete step toward complete military independence from American decision-making, creating a parallel system that could operate regardless of Washington's preferences. But the real transformation was just beginning. Europe's military spending revolution. By mid-2025, Europe's defense budgets rose by over 30% since 2021, creating the financial foundation for the most significant military transformation the continent had seen in decades. The speed of this change caught even European finance ministers off guard, as governments redirected hundreds of billions of euros toward military capabilities in months, rather than the typical multi-year budget cycles. The 2025 statistics reveal just how dramatic this shift became. By September 2025, 23 of 32 NATO countries had exceeded the 2% GDP defense spending threshold, with several aiming for 2.5 to 3% by 2027. Poland leads this group at 4.2% of GDP, representing a military budget that exceeds what the country spent on defense in the entire previous decade. Germany's defense spending jumped from 66.8 billion euros in 2024 to 88.5 billion euros by late 2025, making it the fourth largest military spender globally. France increased military spending to 64.7 billion euros, while Sweden's military expenditure surged by 34% to reach the NATO target of 2% of GDP in its first year of membership. European governments created entirely new financing mechanisms to fund this military expansion. The Netherlands established defense infrastructure bonds that allowed private investors to directly fund military projects in exchange for long-term government guarantees. These bonds raised 34 billion euros in their first 6 months, with institutional investors from pension funds to insurance companies purchasing them as stable, government-backed securities. Belgium followed with security investment certificates that offered tax advantages to companies investing in domestic defense production. The European Union activated the Stability and Growth Pact's flexibility clause, allowing member states to increase defense spending by an additional 1.5% of GDP without triggering fiscal oversight procedures. The European defense industry response has been nothing short of transformative. Major contractors like Airbus Defence and Space, Leonardo, and Rheinmetall are reporting order backlogs that extend into 2029. The European defense industry generated a turnover of 158.8 billion euros in 2023, a 16.9% increase from the previous year, with growth evident across military aeronautics, naval, and land sectors. European military exports reached 57.4 billion euros in 2023, up 12.6% from 2022. The industry added 581,000 jobs in 2023, an 8.9% increase that still cannot meet current demand. Ammunition production capacity represents the most. Dramatic industrial expansion. Europe ramped production from 300,000 artillery shells annually to nearly 1 million shells by 2025. Yet manufacturers still report waiting lists extending 18 months for new orders. Rheinmetall increased artillery shell production capacity by 340% in 2025, but cannot meet current European demand. MBDA, Europe's largest missile manufacturer, expanded production facilities in France, Italy, and the United Kingdom simultaneously, yet their waiting list for precision-guided munitions extends well into 2026. The European Commission's Rearm Europe plan aims to leverage 800 billion euros in defense spending by 2029 through a combination of EU-backed loans, national spending increases, and private capital mobilization. The EU allocated 16.4 billion euros to security and defense activities under the current budget framework, including 8 billion euros for the European Defence Fund to boost defense research and development. An additional 500 million euros supports ammunition production capacity expansion across member states. Europe now fields over 1.4 million active troops and more than 15,000 combat aircraft, roughly half the global total. But readiness and interoperability lag behind the raw numbers. The technological breakthroughs emerging from this spending surge are reshaping European military capabilities in ways that could permanently alter global defense dynamics. The Franco-German Future Combat Air System has accelerated development due to increased funding, with prototype testing now scheduled for 2027. The European Long-Range Strike Missile Program received 23 billion euros in additional funding, potentially creating weapon systems that rival American capabilities. The sustainability question looms over this transformation. European finance ministers privately expressed concerns about maintaining these spending levels beyond 2027 without triggering significant economic disruption. The European Central Bank has warned that current military spending increases could contribute to inflationary pressures if sustained at current levels for more than 3 years. Several smaller European economies are showing strain, with debt-to-GDP ratios rising toward levels that could trigger EU fiscal oversight. However, the industrial capacity and technological innovation emerging from this unprecedented investment surge has created something European leaders had only dreamed of for decades: the foundation for complete military independence from American support. The question was no longer whether Europe could afford to defend itself, but whether European governments had the political will to take the final step toward strategic autonomy. The answer would come from a series of classified meetings that began taking place in secure locations across European capitals. The new European Defense Alliance. At the June 2025 NATO summit, allies adopted a new defense investment pledge requiring member nations to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense by 2030, marking the most ambitious spending commitment in the alliance's history. This pledge emerged from months of intense negotiations as European leaders recognized that their security environment had fundamentally changed. The summit also finalized NATO's new force model, originally agreed upon in Madrid, which requires 300,000 troops at high readiness and assigns stronger European readiness roles across the continent. The force model represents a complete restructuring of NATO's military capabilities, with European nations taking primary responsibility for regional defense sectors that had previously relied heavily on American forces. Germany now leads the multinational division responsible for Central European defense, coordinating forces from 8 allied nations. France commands the Southern European sector, managing military assets from Spain to Italy. Poland oversees Eastern European readiness, coordinating with Baltic states and other frontline nations. Britain maintains responsibility for Northern European maritime security, working closely with Scandinavian allies. NATO's defense planning process has allocated specific targets for air defense and long-range fires among allies, creating a more distributed and resilient defense structure. European nations committed to deploying 2,400 additional air defense systems by 2027, with Germany providing 340 systems, France contributing 280, and Poland installing 190 advanced air defense batteries. The long-range fires allocation requires European allies to field 1,200 precision strike systems, including cruise missiles and long-range artillery, distributed across strategic locations from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The technological integration emerging from this enhanced European cooperation has accelerated beyond what military planners anticipated. Joint European defense projects that were scheduled for completion in 2028 have been fast-tracked to 2026 due to increased funding and political urgency. The European Long-Range Strike Missile Program received an additional 23 billion euros in funding, potentially creating weapon systems that match American capabilities. The Franco-German Future Combat Air System has moved from concept to prototype testing, with first flights now scheduled for 2027 rather than the original 2030 timeline. European intelligence sharing has expanded through new networks that connect member nations more closely than traditional NATO structures allowed. The European Intelligence Fusion Center, established in May 2025, processes information from 12 European intelligence services and creates comprehensive threat assessments shared in real time with military commanders. This center has identified 127 potential security threats across Europe since becoming operational, including cyber attacks, terrorist activities, and foreign intelligence operations. The intelligence sharing protocols allow for information exchange within minutes rather than the hours or days required through traditional diplomatic channels. Military exercises conducted by European allies in 2025 have demonstrated capabilities that surprised even NATO commanders. Exercise Iron Unity in August involved coordinated air operations between German, French, Polish, and British forces over the Baltic Sea, with 120 aircraft participating in scenarios that simulated defense against large-scale aerial attacks. Exercise Rapid Shield in September tested European allies' ability to deploy armored divisions from multiple countries to a single location within 72 hours, successfully moving 8,000 vehicles and 23,000 personnel across 4 national borders using European transportation networks. The financial mechanisms supporting this transformation have created entirely new forms of defense cooperation. The European Defence Fund allocated 8 billion euros for joint research and development projects, while the European Peace Facility provided an additional 12 billion euros for military assistance programs. European nations established bilateral defense investment agreements that allow for shared procurement of major weapon systems, reducing costs while increasing interoperability. The Netherlands and Belgium jointly purchased 48 F-35 fighter aircraft, while Poland and Britain signed agreements for shared maintenance facilities and training programs. American military leadership has responded to European military autonomy with mixed reactions. Pentagon officials acknowledge that European military independence reduces American financial and logistical burdens, but they express concerns about coordination challenges and potential conflicts of interest. General Christopher Cavally, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, has noted in briefings that enhanced European capabilities create both opportunities and challenges for alliance coordination. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have particular concerns about intelligence sharing protocols and whether European forces would maintain full coordination with American units during joint operations. The ultimate objective of this European defense transformation extends beyond simple military cooperation. European leaders envision a defense structure that can operate effectively whether American support is available or not, creating strategic flexibility that Europe has never possessed. This transformation represents Europe's evolution from a junior partner dependent on American protection to a capable partner ready for independent action when necessary. However, the success of this European military transformation would soon face its most serious test. The new defense capabilities and spending commitments that emerged from the 2025 NATO summit would be challenged by pressures that threatened to reshape the alliance in ways that none of the European leaders had anticipated. Trump's NATO pressure campaign results. Trump's pressure campaign against NATO allies throughout 2025 created confrontations unlike anything the alliance had experienced since its founding. According to leaked diplomatic cables, Trump's first video conference with NATO allies in February 2025 lasted only 37 minutes before he abruptly ended the call after telling German Chancellor Olaf Scholz that Germany was freeloading off American taxpayers while funding Russian energy imports. The call was supposed to discuss coordinated responses to the Ukraine crisis, but Trump spent most of the time reading defense spending statistics and questioning why the United States should continue protecting countries that he claimed were not meeting their obligations. The ultimatums Trump delivered to individual NATO members were more specific and aggressive than anything his first administration had attempted. In March 2025, Trump sent personal letters to the leaders of 8 NATO countries, including Germany, Belgium, Spain, and Canada, demanding that they increase defense spending to 5% of GDP within 18 months or face immediate consequences for the security relationship. The letters, written on White House letterhead, specified that failure to meet these targets would result in the withdrawal of American troops from their territories and the suspension of intelligence sharing agreements. European leaders described these communications as unprecedented in their directness and hostile tone. The specific threats Trump made regarding American troop withdrawals sent shockwaves through European capitals and military planning offices. In April 2025, Trump announced that the United States would begin reducing its military presence in Europe by 40% over the following 12 months, starting with the closure of 3 major bases in Germany. The plan called for removing approximately 34,000 American military personnel from European soil, including key logistics and intelligence units that European forces had relied upon for decades. Trump stated that these reductions would continue until European allies demonstrated serious commitment to their own defense through actual spending, not just promises. European leaders responded to these threats with a mixture of public diplomacy and private panic. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak flew to Washington for an unscheduled meeting with Trump in May 2025, but the meeting lasted only 45 minutes and ended without any joint statements or agreements. French President Emmanuel Macron attempted to organize a coordinated European response, but his efforts were complicated by disagreements among European leaders about how directly to confront Trump's demands. Some Eastern European countries, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, were willing to meet Trump's spending requirements, while Western European nations questioned whether such massive expenditures were sustainable or necessary. The emergency NATO summit that convened in Brussels in June 2025 was originally scheduled for 3 days, but extended to 6 days as discussions became increasingly heated and complex. The summit's opening session, normally a ceremonial affair with prepared statements, turned into a 4-hour debate about the fundamental purpose and structure of the alliance. Trump participated via video link and spent his allocated speaking time presenting a PowerPoint presentation about American military expenditures in Europe since 1949, arguing that the United States had subsidized European welfare states for 75 years while they neglected their basic security responsibilities. The alliance's future genuinely appeared uncertain during the summit's third day, when Trump threatened to invoke Article 13 of the NATO treaty, which allows any member to withdraw from the alliance with 1 year's notice. This threat was made during a closed-door session with no official transcript. But multiple European officials confirmed that Trump stated the United States would begin withdrawal procedures unless specific spending commitments were made within 6 months. The threat created an immediate crisis atmosphere, with several smaller NATO members expressing concerns that American withdrawal would leave them exposed to Russian aggression. Trump's pressure tactics produced results that were exactly opposite to what he had intended. Rather than increasing European dependence on American security guarantees, the threats accelerated European efforts to develop independent military capabilities. The European Defense Solidarity Fund, which had been under discussion for months, was formally established during the NATO summit with initial funding commitments that exceeded 200 billion euros. European leaders presented this fund as a complement to NATO, but privately acknowledged that it was designed to function independently of American participation or approval. The new NATO structure that emerged from the crisis talks represented the most significant reorganization of alliance leadership since the Cold War. The Supreme Allied Commander Europe position, traditionally held by an American general, was modified to include a European deputy commander with equal authority over European-based operations. 3 new regional commands were created, each headed by European officers and responsible for coordinating defense activities in specific geographic areas without requiring American oversight. Several European nations began hosting each other's military forces as an alternative to relying solely on American bases and personnel. France agreed to establish permanent British military facilities on French soil for the first time since World War II. Germany and Poland signed agreements allowing for reciprocal basing rights, with German forces stationed at Polish facilities and Polish units operating from German installations. Italy and Spain created joint naval operations centers that coordinate Mediterranean security activities without involving American Mediterranean Fleet commands. The outcome of Trump's pressure campaign was precisely the opposite of his stated objectives. NATO did become stronger, but through European initiative and leadership rather than American dominance. European defense capabilities expanded dramatically. European military cooperation deepened significantly, and European strategic autonomy advanced by decades in a matter of months. Trump's attempt to force greater European dependence on American protection instead accelerated European independence from American security guarantees, creating a more balanced but less American-controlled alliance structure. Meanwhile, Trump had made bold promises during his 2024 campaign about ending the Ukraine conflict within 24 hours of taking office. As months passed without any American-led peace deal materializing, European leaders began to realize they would need to take matters into their own hands regarding the Ukraine endgame that strategy, was reshaping their comprehensive support package that emerged from European capitals during March and April 2025 totaled 20.2 billion euros, representing the largest 2-month aid commitment since the war began. The European Union allocated 10.4 billion euros in military assistance and 9.8 billion euros in humanitarian and financial support, exceeding American assistance levels for the same period by more than 300%. This aid package was approved through emergency procedures that bypassed normal EU legislative processes, demonstrating European determination to support Ukraine regardless of American preferences or policies. The increased European aid fundamentally changed the negotiation dynamics by removing Russian assumptions that Ukrainian resistance would collapse without American support. European military assistance included advanced weapon systems that had previously been withheld, including long-range precision missiles, sophisticated air defense systems, and electronic warfare equipment. The aid also included direct budget support that allowed the Ukrainian government to maintain essential services and military operations without relying on American financial assistance. This comprehensive support package demonstrated that Europe could sustain Ukrainian resistance independently of American policy decisions. The alliance that developed between European nations and Ukraine during this period became stronger and more comprehensive than the previous U.S.-Ukraine relationship had ever been. European support was not limited to military aid, but included extensive economic integration, with Ukraine receiving preferential trade agreements, investment guarantees, and reconstruction commitments that totaled over 150 billion euros through 2030. European nations also provided direct technical assistance for Ukrainian government operations, including cybersecurity support, intelligence sharing, and administrative expertise that help Ukraine maintain functionality despite ongoing conflict. Russia's reaction to Europe's increased involvement created new tensions that complicated the broader geopolitical situation. Russian officials publicly accused European nations of prolonging unnecessary bloodshed and threatened economic retaliation against countries providing substantial aid to Ukraine. Russia imposed sanctions on several European companies and suspended natural gas deliveries to 3 European nations that had significantly increased their Ukrainian aid contributions. Russian military forces also began conducting exercises near European borders, particularly in the Baltic region, as a demonstration of Moscow's displeasure with European policy changes. European leaders developed new peacekeeping proposals that offered alternatives to American-led diplomatic solutions while maintaining support for Ukrainian territorial integrity. The European Peace Initiative, announced in May 2025, proposed a phased approach to conflict resolution that would begin with humanitarian ceasefires and progress toward comprehensive political settlements. This initiative emphasized European mediation rather than American leadership, and included provisions for European peacekeeping forces to monitor any eventual agreements. The proposals were designed to demonstrate that Europe could manage regional security challenges without relying on American diplomatic intervention. The continuation of a Ukraine conflict, rather than weakening European unity, actually strengthened European resolve and cooperation in ways that surprised political analysts across the continent. The shared challenge of supporting Ukraine created unprecedented levels of coordination between European military forces, intelligence services, and diplomatic institutions. European public opinion polls showed increasing support for Ukrainian aid and European military independence, with 73% of Europeans supporting continued assistance to Ukraine even if it meant higher defense, spending, and economic costs. Trump's tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automotive products began in March 2025 at 25%, targeting approximately $380 billion of EU exports according to U.S. trade data. The European Union drafted reciprocal tariffs worth 26 billion euros in retaliation, but suspended implementation pending further negotiations, as reported by Reuters. The bilateral economic impact remained modest, with EU GDP affected by 0.2 to 0.5% according to economic research, but the psychological effect on transatlantic relations was far more significant. European companies began reassessing their American market exposure and supply chain dependencies as the tariff threats escalated throughout the spring of 2025. Major European manufacturers started exploring alternative markets and suppliers to reduce their vulnerability to American trade policy changes. This strategic pivot represented the beginning of a broader economic realignment that would reshape global trade relationships in ways that neither American nor European policymakers had fully anticipated. Europe's response to the Ukraine crisis became the catalyst for the broader geopolitical transformation that would define European foreign policy for the remainder of the decade, establishing Europe as an independent strategic actor capable of pursuing its own interests regardless of American preferences. The military, diplomatic, and economic independence that European nations achieved through their Ukraine support efforts created the foundation for even more dramatic changes in transatlantic relations that would soon emerge through economic channels. The success of European military and diplomatic independence in the Ukraine crisis gave European leaders confidence to challenge American economic dominance in ways they had never previously considered. This confidence would soon be tested as economic tensions between the United States and Europe reached levels not seen since the trade disputes of the 1970s. economic warfare, and trade realignments. The escalation began with Trump's announcement of immediate tariffs on European steel, aluminum, and automotive imports in April 2025. Trump stated that European nations had been ripping off American workers for decades and imposed tariffs of 25% on steel, 30% on aluminum, and 15% on automobiles, taking effect within 10 days. European stock markets opened that morning with massive sell-offs, with the German DAX dropping 4.2% and the French CAC 40 falling 3.8% in the first hour of trading. The automotive sector was hit particularly hard, with Volkswagen shares plummeting 8.3% and BMW dropping 7.1% as investors calculated the immediate impact on their largest export market. The retaliatory tariffs announced by the European Union just 72 hours later targeted American agricultural products, technology exports, and energy equipment with precision designed to maximize political pressure on Trump's administration. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced tariffs of 40% on American soybeans, 35% on bourbon whiskey, 25% on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and 20% on various technology products, including semiconductors and software. These tariffs were specifically chosen to impact swing states that had supported Trump in the 2024 election, with soybean tariffs targeting farming communities in Iowa and Wisconsin, bourbon tariffs affecting Kentucky, and motorcycle tariffs impacting Wisconsin manufacturing jobs. Within 6 months, the trade conflict had escalated into what economists began calling the most severe transatlantic trade war since the 1930s. The European Union imposed additional tariffs on 847 American products worth approximately $43 billion in annual trade value. The United States responded with expanded tariffs covering 1,204 European products valued at $67 billion annually. The escalation created a feedback loop where each round of tariffs prompted immediate retaliation, with the total value of goods subject to punitive tariffs reaching substantial levels by October 2025. At the G7 summit in June 2025, European leaders attempted to address the escalating tariff situation through diplomatic channels. France proposed a zero-for-zero tariff agreement that would eliminate all industrial tariffs between the United States and Europe. But Trump rejected the proposal during the Quebec ministerial meetings that followed. European officials described Trump's response as dismissive, with the American president stating that Europe needed to pay its fair share before any tariff reductions could be considered. European companies responded to these trade barriers by rapidly restructuring their supply chains and market strategies to reduce dependence on American commerce. Volkswagen announced in June 2025 that it would redirect 60% of its North American production to markets in Asia and Latin America, while simultaneously increasing production capacity in Mexico and Brazil. Airbus accelerated its partnerships with airlines in India, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, signing contracts worth $89 billion with non-American carriers. ASML, the Dutch semiconductor equipment manufacturer, shifted its expansion plans away from American facilities toward new production centers in South Korea and Taiwan. The new trade partnerships that Europe forged to replace American commerce created economic relationships that had never existed on such a scale. The European Union signed comprehensive trade agreements with the Mercosur bloc of South American countries, creating a combined market of 780 million consumers with reduced tariffs on thousands of products. European companies established major operations in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, with German manufacturers alone investing 23 billion euros in Southeast Asian facilities during 2025. The EU-Africa Trade Partnership, signed in September 2025, created preferential trading relationships between European companies and 34 African nations, establishing supply chains for raw materials and manufacturing that bypassed American intermediaries entirely. The economic conflict accelerated Europe's development of independent technologies and supply chains in sectors where American companies had previously dominated. European semiconductor companies received 47 billion euros in government, funding to develop chip manufacturing capabilities that could compete with American producers. The European Space Agency expanded its satellite internet constellation to provide alternatives to American satellite services, while European cloud computing companies like SAP and Atos increased their data center capacity by 340% to offer alternatives to Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure. Currency warfare emerged as Europe systematically reduced its reliance on the dollar for international transactions, creating the most significant challenge to dollar dominance since the Bretton Woods system collapsed. The European Central Bank established currency swap agreements with central banks in China, India, Brazil, and 15 other countries, allowing international trade to be conducted in euros rather than dollars. European companies began invoicing their exports in euros even when selling to non-European customers, reducing dollar transaction volumes by an estimated $180 billion annually. American companies operating in Europe found themselves caught in an impossible situation as the trade conflict created conflicting pressures from both sides of the Atlantic. General Electric faced demands from European customers to guarantee that its products contained no components subject to American export restrictions, while simultaneously facing pressure from Washington to limit technology transfers to European partners. Ford Motor Company announced in August 2025 that it would split its European operations into a separate legal entity to shield its European business from American trade restrictions. The long-term consequence of this economic warfare was Europe's transformation into a more globally integrated economy with significantly reduced dependence on American markets and financial systems. As American attention and resources became increasingly focused on other strategic priorities, Europe found itself with unprecedented opportunities to expand its influence in regions that had previously been dominated by American interests. The China factor and Pacific pivot. Trump's singular focus on containing China created the most significant diplomatic opportunity for European global influence since the end of the Cold War. While American policymakers concentrated intensively on countering Chinese expansion in Asia, entire regions found themselves with reduced American diplomatic attention and engagement. This shift became particularly evident in 2025 as American embassies in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America received instructions to reduce their diplomatic activities and redirect personnel toward Pacific region assignments. The State Department quietly closed 3 consulates in West Africa and reduced staff at diplomatic missions in 12 Latin American countries to fund expanded operations in Taiwan, the Philippines, and other Pacific allies. The diplomatic vacuum that emerged in these regions was immediate and substantial. Countries that had relied on American diplomatic engagement for decades suddenly found themselves with limited access to American officials and reduced participation in American-led international initiatives. In sub-Saharan Africa, American development programs worth $4.7 billion were suspended or transferred to other agencies as resources shifted toward Pacific priorities. Latin American nations that had participated in American-sponsored trade and security programs reported significant reductions in American engagement, with several countries noting that scheduled diplomatic visits were canceled or postponed indefinitely. European nations recognized this opportunity and moved rapidly to expand their diplomatic and economic presence in regions where American influence was declining. France increased its diplomatic missions in West Africa by 40% during 2025, opening new consulates in Senegal, Mali, and Burkina Faso, while expanding existing facilities in Ivory Coast and Nigeria. Germany established new trade offices in 6 Latin American countries and expanded its diplomatic presence in Colombia, Peru, and Chile with specific mandates to develop economic partnerships. Italy opened its first embassy in Chad since 1973 and expanded its diplomatic facilities in Ethiopia and Kenya, while Spain increased its consular services in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia by 60%. The strategic partnerships that Europe formed with countries feeling abandoned by America's Pacific pivot created new geopolitical alignments that had never existed before, Brazil signed a comprehensive partnership agreement with the European Union in June 2025 that included preferential trade terms, technology transfer agreements, and security cooperation provisions. The agreement represented Brazil's most significant diplomatic shift away from American influence since the 1960s. Argentina followed with similar agreements with individual European nations, including a major defense cooperation pact with France that included arms sales and military training programs. Mexico, despite its geographic proximity to the United States, signed expanded economic agreements with Germany and Spain that reduced its dependence on American markets. European leaders deliberately positioned their nations as more reliable partners than the increasingly unpredictable United States by emphasizing diplomatic consistency and long-term commitment. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell stated in multiple diplomatic meetings that Europe offered stable, predictable partnerships based on mutual respect rather than transactional relationships subject to political changes. This messaging resonated particularly strongly with African leaders who had experienced sudden shifts in American policy with each new presidential administration. European diplomats emphasized their continuity of engagement and multi-decade development commitments as alternatives to American approaches that could change dramatically based on domestic political considerations. Military cooperation agreements that Europe signed with non-NATO allies demonstrated the continent's growing global security influence as American attention shifted elsewhere. France signed defense cooperation agreements with Senegal, Mali, and Burkina Faso that included provisions for joint military exercises, weapons sales, and training programs. Germany established military partnership agreements with Kenya and Ethiopia that focused on peacekeeping capabilities and regional security cooperation. Spain expanded its military cooperation with Morocco and Algeria, including agreements for joint naval patrols in the Mediterranean and counterterrorism cooperation. The competition between European and American influence created tension in several key strategic regions where both sides sought to maintain or expand their presence. In the Middle East, European nations increased their diplomatic engagement with Gulf states, while American attention focused on Pacific security concerns. The European Union signed a comprehensive partnership agreement with the United Arab Emirates that included energy cooperation, financial services integration, and security partnerships. Similar agreements with Saudi Arabia and Qatar positioned European companies as preferred partners for major infrastructure and energy projects that had previously gone to American companies. Europe's diplomatic approach contrasted favorably with America's increasingly confrontational stance by emphasizing economic cooperation, cultural exchange, and multilateral problem-solving rather than military solutions or ultimatums. European diplomats consistently promoted negotiated settlements to regional conflicts, while American policy became increasingly focused on military deterrence and economic sanctions. This approach proved particularly effective in Africa, where European development programs offered alternatives to both American military-focused aid and Chinese infrastructure investments. The economic investments that Europe made in developing nations represented commitments that America could no longer afford due to its massive Pacific military expenditures. European development banks committed 67 billion euros to infrastructure projects across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia during 2025, focusing on renewable energy, transportation, and telecommunications projects. These investments were structured as long-term partnerships rather than traditional aid relationships, giving recipient countries greater control over project implementation and outcomes. Trump's Pacific pivot inadvertently created the strategic space that allowed Europe to emerge as an independent global superpower with influence spanning multiple continents, where American presence had previously dominated. This global expansion of European influence established Europe as a third major power center alongside the United States and China rather than a junior partner in an American-led alliance system. However, this dramatic shift in international influence required equally dramatic changes within European domestic politics to sustain the new strategic direction. Internal European political transformations. European voters delivered unprecedented electoral mandates for continental independence throughout 2025, creating political earthquakes unlike anything the continent had witnessed since the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe during the late 1980s. Traditional governing coalitions that had maintained stability for decades suddenly found themselves facing defeats as citizens demanded fundamental changes in how their countries approached international relations and continental integration. In Germany, the Social Democratic Party lost 127 seats in regional elections during the spring of 2025, while the Christian Democratic Union saw its support collapse in 3 key states where American military bases were located. France experienced similar upheaval when Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance Party gained unprecedented support after his confrontational approach with Trump, with French media outlets praising Macron for sticking it to the man during tense diplomatic meetings with the American president. The electoral victories of pro-European integration parties across the continent represented the most significant political realignment since the founding of the European Union itself. In the Netherlands, the European Unity Party, formed just 18 months earlier, won 23% of the vote in national elections by campaigning exclusively on reducing Dutch dependence on American security guarantees and increasing European military cooperation. Belgium's Federal European Movement captured 19% of parliamentary seats after promising to transfer Belgian defense spending away from NATO contributions toward European-only military programs. Poland's European Independence Coalition achieved stunning success by winning 34% of the vote despite the country's historically strong ties to the United States, with voters responding to campaign messages about Polish sovereignty and European solidarity. Traditional political alignments that had defined European politics since World War II began fracturing as voters demanded stronger continental unity and reduced American influence. Conservative parties that had historically supported Atlantic partnerships found themselves losing support to new movements that emphasized European autonomy. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party split into 2 factions, with the larger group supporting increased European integration, while a smaller group maintained traditional pro-American positions. Spain's People's Party experienced similar internal divisions, with regional party organizations in Catalonia and the Basque Country openly supporting European independence movements, while national leadership attempted to maintain traditional Atlantic relationships. Several European nations implemented constitutional changes specifically designed to enable faster military and economic integration with other European countries while reducing institutional barriers to continental cooperation. Germany amended its basic law to allow for automatic budget reallocations toward European defense projects without requiring parliamentary approval for each individual expenditure. The changes, approved by a 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament, created constitutional mechanisms for rapid military spending increases during security crises. France modified its constitution to permit shared sovereignty arrangements with other European nations in defense and security matters, allowing French military assets to be placed under joint European command structures. Poland's constitutional amendments enable the government to enter binding military cooperation agreements with European partners without requiring individual parliamentary approval for each agreement. Populist movements that had previously celebrated closer ties with Trump's America experienced dramatic losses in support as his policies began directly harming European economic and security interests. The Alternative for Germany Party, which had praised Trump during his first presidency, lost 43% of its support in regional elections after Trump's trade tariffs damaged German manufacturing jobs. Italy's Lega Party, led by Matteo Salvini, saw its poll numbers drop by 31% after Salvini's continued support for Trump became politically toxic among Italian voters facing American trade restrictions. France's National Rally, despite Marine Le Pen's attempts to distance herself from Trump, lost ground to pro-European parties that offered concrete alternatives to American economic dependence. The generational divide that emerged across Europe created the most significant age-based political split since the 1960s student movements. Citizens over age 65 who had lived through the Cold War and remembered American protection during the Soviet threat remained more supportive of maintaining Atlantic partnerships, even as Trump's policies harmed European interests. Polling data from across Europe showed that 67% of voters over 65 still favored maintaining strong ties with the United States despite trade disputes and security disagreements. In contrast, 74% of voters under age 35 supported European independence from American military and economic influence, viewing Trump's policies as evidence that America could no longer be trusted as a reliable partner for European security and prosperity. European media coverage of America became increasingly critical throughout 2025, shaping public opinion through detailed reporting on how Trump's policies harmed European interests, while presenting European integration as the practical solution to American unreliability. German media outlets published extensive analyses showing how American trade tariffs had cost German workers thousands of jobs, while European trade partnerships offered better alternatives. French television networks provided regular coverage of American military base closures and their economic impact on local communities, while highlighting how European defense cooperation could provide better security guarantees. Italian newspapers detailed how American economic policies had damaged Italian exports, while European market integration offered more stable trading relationships. New political movements emerged across Europe, specifically designed to promote continental unity and complete autonomy from American influence. The European Sovereignty Movement, founded in Brussels in March 2025, established chapters in 14 European countries within 6 months, and focused exclusively on achieving European independence in defense, economics, and diplomacy. The Continental Unity Party, formed through cooperation between politicians from France, Germany, and Poland, campaigned on platforms calling for a European federation with unified foreign policy and defense capabilities. The domestic political transformations occurring across Europe created the democratic mandate that European leaders needed to implement their dramatic foreign policy shifts, as voters explicitly supported candidates and parties that promised greater European independence and reduced American influence in continental affairs. This political foundation enabled European governments to launch initiatives that would have been impossible under previous electoral circumstances, including massive technology programs designed to eliminate European dependence on systems and energy independence by foreign powers. The Comprehensive Technology Initiative that Europe launched in May 2025 represented the most ambitious independence program since the Manhattan Project. European leaders recognized that their continent's reliance on American and Chinese technology systems created vulnerabilities that could be exploited during geopolitical crises. The program received initial funding of 340 billion euros from the European Union budget, with additional contributions from individual member nations totaling another 180 billion euros. This massive investment dwarfed previous European technology initiatives and represented approximately 3.2% of the combined GDP of participating nations. The program scope included semiconductor manufacturing, artificial intelligence development, quantum computing research, cybersecurity systems, and space technology, with the explicit goal of creating European alternatives to all critical technologies currently dominated by foreign powers. European semiconductor manufacturing received the largest single investment within the Technology Independence Program, with 127 billion euros allocated specifically for chip production facilities across the continent. The Netherlands expanded ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography capabilities to produce the most advanced semiconductors without relying on American or Asian suppliers. Germany constructed 3 new semiconductor fabrication facilities in Bavaria and Saxony, each capable of producing chips with 7-nanometer precision. France established a specialized compound semiconductor facility in Grenoble focused on producing chips for military and aerospace applications. These facilities were designed to operate completely independently of American equipment or software, using only European-developed manufacturing tools and processes. By December 2025, European semiconductor production capacity had increased by 240% compared to the previous year. The artificial intelligence and quantum computing investments created European capabilities that rival or exceed those of American tech giants. European companies received 89 billion euros in funding to develop AI systems specifically designed for European languages, legal frameworks, and cultural contexts. The European Quantum Computing Consortium, formed by researchers from 12 universities, developed quantum processors that achieved 1,000 qubit stability, surpassing IBM's most advanced systems. These quantum computers were integrated into European financial systems, telecommunications networks, and defense applications, creating computational capabilities that operate independently of American or Chinese quantum networks. Europe's energy crisis created the perfect catalyst for breakthrough renewable energy innovations that transformed the continent's energy landscape within months rather than years. The crisis forced European governments to accelerate renewable energy development beyond anything previously attempted, with emergency funding of 156 billion euros directed towards solar, wind, and energy storage projects. German engineers developed new photovoltaic cell designs that achieved 47% efficiency rates, significantly higher than previous solar technology. Danish wind turbine manufacturers created offshore wind systems capable of generating 20 megawatts per turbine, double the capacity of existing designs. These innovations were developed entirely within Europe using European materials and manufacturing processes, ensuring complete energy technology independence. European financial institutions began implementing the Digital Operational Resilience Act in March 2025, with full compliance required by January 17, 2025. This regulation strengthened European financial systems against cyber threats, while reducing dependence on American technology providers. The AI Act implementation, scheduled for 2025 through 2027, created European standards for artificial intelligence development that prioritized European values and regulatory frameworks over American or Chinese approaches. These regulatory frameworks gave European companies competitive advantages in their home markets while establishing technological standards that could be exported globally. European tech companies experienced unprecedented growth as they rapidly scaled operations to compete directly with American technology giants. Government contracts worth 67 billion euros were awarded exclusively to European technology providers, while regulatory frameworks favored European companies over American competitors. European cloud computing companies expanded their server capacity by 450% during 2025, offering alternatives to Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure that kept European data within European borders. European software companies developed operating systems, productivity software, and mobile applications that provided full alternatives to American products while maintaining compatibility with existing European business systems. The breakthrough battery and energy storage technologies that emerged from European research programs solved the continent's energy independence challenges while creating export opportunities for European companies. European battery manufacturers developed lithium-ion systems with energy densities 340% higher than previous designs, while new solid-state batteries offered even greater performance improvements. These batteries were integrated into European electrical grids, allowing renewable energy to be stored and distributed efficiently across national borders. European energy storage systems now provide backup power for critical infrastructure and can maintain electrical grid stability during peak demand periods without requiring fossil fuel backup systems. European space programs expanded dramatically to reduce dependence on American satellites and launch capabilities, with the European Space Agency receiving 45 billion euros in additional funding during 2025. Europe launched 23 new satellites during the year, creating independent capabilities for communications, navigation, and Earth observation that operate completely separately from American satellite networks. European rocket technology advanced rapidly, with new launch vehicles capable of deploying larger payloads at lower costs than American alternatives. These space capabilities provide European governments and businesses with satellite services that cannot be interrupted or monitored by foreign powers. This comprehensive technological independence program created the foundation for Europe's broader geopolitical autonomy by ensuring that European governments, businesses, and citizens could operate without depending on foreign technology systems that might be compromised during international crises. The success of Europe's transformation began attracting attention from other regions and nations that had long accepted American technological dominance as inevitable, creating possibilities that no one had anticipated. The domino effect across global alliances. The successful European transformation created ripple effects that spread far beyond the continent's borders, inspiring similar independence movements among America's most trusted allies across multiple regions. The speed and scope of European autonomy demonstrated that even the closest American partners could successfully reduce their dependence on Washington's security guarantees and economic systems. This realization triggered a wave of strategic reassessments in capitals from Seoul to Canberra, as governments that had relied on American protection for decades began questioning whether such dependence remained necessary or even advisable in an era of unpredictable American leadership. China, Japan, and South Korea resumed their trilateral economic dialogue in June 2025 to address the aid gaps left by reduced American engagement, according to Reuters. The three nations established new cooperation frameworks that operated independently of American oversight or participation. This trilateral partnership focused on supply chain integration, technology sharing, and coordinated responses to regional security challenges. The dialogue marked the first time since World War II that these three countries had created comprehensive economic cooperation mechanisms without American involvement or approval. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership served as an alternative trade bloc that reduced Asian dependence on American markets while strengthening intra-regional commerce. Countries like South Korea began questioning their dependence on American security guarantees as they observed Europe's successful military independence. South Korean defense officials studied European defense spending models and concluded that their country could achieve similar autonomy by increasing defense expenditures from 2.8% to 4.2% of GDP over 3 years. This increase would fund domestic weapons production, advanced missile defense systems, and expanded military cooperation with regional partners, including Japan and Australia. South Korean officials privately acknowledged that Trump's unpredictable approach to alliance management had created uncertainty about American commitment levels that made European-style independence increasingly attractive. Japan's strategic reassessment accelerated during 2025 as Japanese leaders recognized that European nations had successfully reduced their American dependence without triggering security crises. Japanese Defense Minister Minoru Kuhara announced plans to increase defense spending to 3.5% of GDP by 2027, focusing on indigenous weapons development and expanded partnerships with European defense contractors. Japan signed preliminary agreements with France and Germany for joint development of advanced missile systems and cyber warfare capabilities, creating the first significant Japanese-European defense partnerships since World War II. These agreements specifically excluded American participation, marking a dramatic shift in Japanese strategic thinking. Australia's government initiated comprehensive reviews of its alliance relationships after observing how European nations had strengthened their security while reducing American dependence. Australian officials conducted classified studies examining whether their country could maintain regional security through expanded partnerships with European nations, Japan, and India rather than relying primarily on American security guarantees. The Australian Defence Force increased its cooperation with European military forces, participating in joint exercises with French and German units, while exploring equipment purchases from European rather than American manufacturers. New multilateral partnerships emerged as traditional American-led alliance structures weakened under the pressure of Trump's unpredictable policies. The Indo-Pacific Security Dialogue, established in September 2025, brought together Japan, South Korea, Australia, and several European nations to coordinate regional security responses without American participation. This forum conducted quarterly meetings focused on maritime security, cybersecurity cooperation, and coordinated responses to regional threats. The dialogue deliberately excluded the United States, marking the first time since World War II that major American allies had created a security coordination mechanism without American involvement. International organizations experienced unprecedented challenges to American influence as European alternatives gained credibility and support. The World Bank faced its first serious challenge since its founding when European nations established the Global Development Finance Institution with initial capital of 120 billion euros. This institution offered development loans and technical assistance to developing countries with less stringent conditions than traditional World Bank programs. The International Monetary Fund encountered similar competition when European nations created the European Monetary Stability Mechanism, which provided emergency financial assistance to countries experiencing currency crises without requiring the austerity measures typically demanded by IMF programs. Diplomatic realignments occurred across multiple regions as nations evaluated the relative advantages of European versus American leadership models. Middle Eastern countries, including the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, increased their diplomatic engagement with European nations while reducing their dependence on American security partnerships. These countries signed comprehensive cooperation agreements with European nations covering energy, defense, and economic development while maintaining more limited relationships with the United States. The shift reflected growing regional confidence that European partnerships offered more stability and predictability than American relationships. The competition for influence in key regions created opportunities for countries to gain leverage by balancing European and American interests against each other. Brazil successfully negotiated favorable trade agreements with both European and American partners by threatening to align exclusively with whichever side offered better terms. India expanded its strategic partnerships with European nations while maintaining its American relationships, creating a balanced approach that maximized Indian influence in international affairs. These global realignments established patterns that would prove far more durable than the specific policies that created them, setting the stage for a fundamentally different world order that would outlast any single American administration. Projecting forward to 2029, the trajectory established during Trump's second term points toward a fundamentally multipolar world where American hegemony has been permanently fractured by January 2029. Based on current developments, Europe will have completed its transformation into a fully independent strategic actor with military capabilities, economic partnerships, and diplomatic influence that operate completely separately from American systems. The European Defense Solidarity Fund will have grown to over 400 billion euros by 2029, while European military production capacity will exceed American levels in several key categories, including artillery systems, air defense networks, and cyber warfare capabilities. European space programs will have launched over 200 satellites, creating communications and navigation systems that rival American GPS and military satellite networks. These developments represent irreversible changes in the global balance of power that will persist regardless of who occupies the White House after Trump. The irreversible nature of Europe's transformation means that future American presidents will inherit a continent that no longer depends on Washington for security, economic stability, or diplomatic leadership. European technological independence will have reached the point where European companies provide alternatives to all major American technology systems, from semiconductors to artificial intelligence to cloud computing services. European financial systems will process international transactions worth over 2 trillion euros annually without involving American banks or dollar-denominated payments. European military forces will have conducted hundreds of joint exercises and operations without American participation, demonstrating complete operational independence that cannot be easily reversed through diplomatic negotiations or policy changes. Europe's new capabilities and partnerships will continue expanding through 2029 regardless of changes in American leadership, because the institutional frameworks and financial commitments are now embedded in European law and international agreements. The European Autonomous Defense Command will have expanded to include 12 member nations with joint military facilities across the continent. European defense contractors will have signed production contracts extending through 2032, ensuring continued military development independent of American approval or cooperation. Trade agreements between Europe and partners in Asia, Africa, and Latin America will have created economic relationships worth over 800 billion euros annually, reducing European dependence on American markets to historically low levels. The potential for serious conflict will increase as America realizes the extent to which it has lost its dominant position in European affairs. American military leaders will face the unprecedented challenge of coordinating with European forces that no longer automatically defer to American command structures or strategic priorities. Economic conflicts will intensify as European companies compete directly with American businesses in markets that were previously dominated by American firms. The EU is expected to face new 20% tariffs on up to 380 billion euros worth of exports to the U.S. While the EU setup makes it uniquely well-positioned to manage a tariff war with its competent trade bureaucracy and power to negotiate on behalf of the entire bloc. The next American president will inherit a transatlantic relationship that has been fundamentally altered beyond recognition. Traditional NATO structures will have evolved into hybrid arrangements where European nations maintain parallel command systems that can operate independently of American oversight. American military bases in Europe will have been reduced by over 60%, with many former American facilities now hosting European forces from multiple nations. Economic ties between America and Europe will have been restructured around competitive rather than cooperative frameworks, with tariffs and trade restrictions creating permanent barriers to the integrated economic relationship that existed before Trump's second term. The economic and military balance of power that will exist in 2029 represents a dramatic shift from the American-dominated system that characterized 2025. Europe's combined defense spending will exceed 650 billion euros annually, approaching parity with American defense expenditures, while focusing specifically on European rather than global security requirements. European economic output will be less dependent on American markets, with transatlantic trade representing only 18% of total European commerce compared to 31% in 2024. The EU economy is forecast to experience moderate growth through 2029, with real GDP growth projected at 1.1% in 2025 and accelerating to 1.5% in 2026, though operating below potential for nearly 7 consecutive years. European public opinion has solidified behind this independence movement, with European Commission polling showing 73% support for continued Ukraine aid and higher defense spending despite economic pressures. This represents a fundamental shift in European attitudes toward American leadership and continental autonomy. European citizens increasingly view their nation's independence from American influence as essential for long-term security and prosperity, creating democratic mandates that will sustain these policies regardless of changing political circumstances. The question of whether the transatlantic relationship can ever be fully repaired remains genuinely uncertain given the structural changes that will have occurred by 2029. European political leaders who have built their careers on promoting European independence will be reluctant to return to American-dependent systems, even if future American administrations offer more cooperative approaches. European defense industries will have invested hundreds of billions of euros in independent production capabilities that would be wasted if European nations returned to purchasing American. Military equipment. Generational changes across Europe will make independence from American influence the new normal for future European leaders who have grown up during the period of transatlantic conflict and European autonomy. Political leaders who entered government during Trump's second term will have built their careers around European independence rather than Atlantic partnership. European military officers will have been trained in systems that operate independently of American command structures. These generational changes will create institutional momentum that maintains European independence even if political circumstances change. The ultimate irony of Trump's second term may be that his attempt to make America great again through demands for greater European dependence actually accelerated the end of American global dominance by forcing Europe to develop independent capabilities that permanently reduced American influence. The long-term consequences of this transformation will reshape international relations in ways that extend far beyond the specific policies that created them. What we are witnessing represents the most significant shift in Western power dynamics since World War II, creating a multipolar world where America must compete with rather than lead its former allies. Trump's second term has fundamentally and permanently altered the global balance of power in ways that will define international relations for decades. Europe has emerged as an independent superpower with military capabilities, economic partnerships, and diplomatic influence that operate completely separately from American systems. The transformation has been supported by substantial European investments in technological independence, including the EU Chips Act funding of 43 billion euros from 2023 through 2027 and comprehensive digital regulations through the Digital Services Act. These initiatives have created the foundation for European autonomy that extends far beyond traditional military and diplomatic independence. Whether this European transformation strengthens or weakens global stability remains the defining question of our time. Are you prepared for a